Well, most scholars exclusively, essentially, believe Jesus existed as a real person. And a high percentage of scholars believe that Jesus believed he was God's eschatological change agent in this world. And so what I'm trying to say is who Jesus said he was is who Jesus believed he was. Now, there's debate on scholars of whether that's true or not, but Jesus believed the words he was saying. He believed that he was the one sent from God to save the world. He was God's Messiah to restore his people to him. And in that same line, most scholars believe that Jesus did things that his followers believed were miracles. That the activities of Jesus, those that were close to him, believed that they were witnessing something that was unusual. Now, scholars debate whether those were actual miracles or not. But what I'm getting at is there's credibility embedded within Jesus, that he committed to who he said he was. But when we think about the followers of Jesus, particularly the disciples, the early church and the movement there, we see that they continued in this trend by committing themselves to the mission of Jesus, not worrying about how things were perceived from a cultural standpoint, or how society viewed what was or wasn't happening. And one of the primary ways that I can think of to show this is how women were viewed in the New Testament. Because during this time, during Jesus and the early church period, men had a much higher status in the world than women. In fact, women were not seen as credible witnesses in a court case at this point, so their testimony was limited at best. But we get to the Gospels in the early church, and we see that women played a prominent role, especially relative to society during this time. And one of the most indicting things is how women were the ones who first witnessed the empty tomb. And when I say indicting, that was indicting to Peter, James, and Paul. They're the ones who were supposed to be closest to Jesus. I said Paul. I meant Peter, James, and John. Sorry about that. But they were the ones who were supposed to be closest to Jesus. They were his closest followers. They were his highest leaders. And they were not the first ones to receive this message. And so they were given a testimony from an uncredible source in the day to the fact that Jesus was alive. And the New Testament doesn't try to hide this fact. If the New Testament, if the early church was focusing on how could we make this most credible from a societal standpoint, they would have changed the story. But the point of Jesus or his followers is not to change the story so that the society, so that culture can digest it easier. That's not what Jesus was doing. He wasn't trying to make it easy for people to accept it. He was displaying God's power and saying, this is the truth that you're actually seeking. You're seeking for truth and you're falling for the lies of this world, but Jesus says there's something greater. And so with Jesus, as he displays through his ministry, and the early church displays this as well, is that these momentary miracles are not the mission. The mission is not to get these minor wins, these little things that just that make us feel better in the moment. That's not the mission that Jesus gave us. He gave us to something deeper. But if we look at our prayer requests, often our prayer requests are filled with these momentary miracles, these momentary victories, these small things to make our life a little better right here, right now. And one of the ways I think of this is if I get a cold, or there's a cold in my family, some type of minor virus, I pray that Jesus would heal us. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. I'm going to keep praying that Jesus would heal us quickly, because those types of things are annoying at best. But I recognize that having a victory, a miracle in that moment is not all-encompassing for the full mission that Jesus has given us. He's calling us to something greater than that momentary victory. And I think the story of Lazarus can really help us understand this, at least where I'm going today. And we find the story of Lazarus in John chapter 11. And it's a longer story, a longer discourse. It's the longest miracle discourse that Jesus has here for, and it's an incredible story of Jesus' power in this world, but what he's calling us to. Because you find at the beginning of John chapter 1 that Lazarus was sick. He lived in Bethany with his sisters Mary and Martha. This was the same Mary that later anointed Jesus' feet with expensive perfume and wiped them with her hair. So the two sisters sent a message to Jesus saying, "Lord, your dear friend is very sick." But when Jesus heard about Lazarus' sickness, he said, "Lazarus' sickness will not end in death. This happened for God's glory, and so that the Son of Man may receive glory through this." So although Jesus loved Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, he stayed where he was for 2 days. So Jesus and Lazarus are friends. Your dear friend is the wording from the translation that I read. So there's some closeness, but he's sick. And as I was thinking of, there was no request for Jesus to come. When Mary and Martha sent the message, they didn't say, "Hey, Lazarus is sick, please come right away." All they did is say, "He is very sick." They stated how he is doing. And part of this, I get the implication that no invitation was required. And we can think of when we have a loved one who is sick, particularly when they get really, really sick, we don't need an invitation to go visit them. I remember when my grandparents were sick to the point where before they passed, and I heard they were sick, I didn't need permission to say, "Hey, you should come." I didn't need an invitation. I went. Right? So Jesus didn't need an invitation in this moment. He was that close with this family. Letting Jesus know that Lazarus was sick was enough. They didn't have to say anything else. They didn't have to extend the invitation. But Mary anoints Jesus' feet with expensive oil or perfume. This is John chapter 11 that Lazarus is sick. It's John chapter 12 where we see Mary anoint Jesus' feet. And it was expensive perfume, and there was kind of debate among people there of what should or shouldn't have happened. But we see that she honored Jesus with that. Now, John chapter 11 is when he washes the disciples' feet. And so we see there's a difference between what Mary did for Jesus and what Jesus did for his disciples. Because washing the feet was a common occurrence in that time frame because they wore sandals and those types of footwear, and so their feet would get dusty, and so they'd go into a house and they'd wash their feet. And washing of the feet was reserved for the lowest of the servants, and so it was a way of Jesus serving his disciples, of humbling himself and honoring them in that regard. Mary's act was not a cleaning, was just an extravagant honoring of Jesus. So there's a difference between what Mary did for Jesus and what Jesus did for his disciples. But Jesus affirms that Lazarus' death, or his sickness, will not end in death. And the disciples, I wonder what was going through their mind. They've heard that Lazarus is sick and say, "All right, sickness is not going to end in death, but what are you going to do about it, Jesus? Why aren't we doing anything? Why are we staying here for 2 more days? Why are we not moving? Why are we not getting to where Lazarus is?" But one of the things Jesus is teaching his disciples here is that momentary miracles are not the mission. Running after every need was not the mission that Jesus had. When I say every need, I mean every temporary need. Every need that was limited to here in this world. That was not the mission that Jesus had. So he waited. He didn't hurry. And sometimes this can frustrate us. When we have a need, we want Jesus to hurry. We don't want Jesus to be slow. When we have something that is on our hearts and we go to Jesus and say, "Jesus, can you do something about it?" We're not saying, "Jesus, can you do something about it in a couple weeks?" We want Jesus to do something about it right here, right now. We don't want him to wait. We want him to do it now. But again, our prayer requests are commonly filled with temporary needs. Another one that comes to mind is when we have some type of major injury that we know we're going to recover from. And when I say know we're going to recover from, that's kind of a limited statement. But one thing's of if you break an arm, that can be hugely inconvenient. And wouldn't it be wonderful if Jesus just came and healed that arm instantly? And he can. That's the thing, he can do that. We've heard stories of that, of God doing miraculous things in that moment. But our prayer requests are so focused on these temporary needs. Now, maybe we talk about a major a broken bone more. Maybe you broke a toe or a finger or something that's annoying, but it's not really going to affect most day-to-day things. Or maybe you broke a rib and you can't sleep for weeks because of the pain with that, right? But those are temporary needs. We recognize that. I'm not trying to downplay. I've broken a couple bones. It doesn't feel pleasant. But those are temporary needs that we go to Jesus on. But we continue in verse 7 when Jesus finally says to his disciples, let's go to Judea. His disciples objected and say, Rabbi, just a couple of days they were trying to stone you and you want to go back there again? Jesus replied, there are 12 hours of daylight every day. During the day, people can walk safely. They can see because they have the light of this world. But at night there is danger of stumbling because they have no light. Then he said, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep. Now I will go and wake him. And the disciples said, Lord, if he is sleeping, he will get better soon. They thought Jesus meant he was actually sleeping, but Jesus meant he was dead. So he told them plainly, Lazarus is dead. And for your sake, I'm glad I wasn't there so that you will really believe. Come, let's go see him. Then Thomas, nicknamed the twin, told his other disciples, let's go too and die with Jesus. So the disciples are concerned for Jesus. They are concerned for his safety. He had some bad experiences in Judea, and they said going there is just not a good idea. So Lazarus was a good friend of Jesus. The disciples likely knew that. They knew that this was a close relationship, that Jesus would want to be there, but the disciples said it's not worth the risk. So essentially, the disciples were looking out for Jesus' best interest. And I say that almost tongue-in-cheek, because were they? Jesus was allowing himself to go into a dangerous situation. By going to Judea, he was potentially putting himself in a dangerous situation, and the disciples said, let's avoid danger. But see, the momentary miracle is not the mission. Having worldly comforts, worldly success, worldly conveniences is not the mission that Jesus has given us. And Jesus knew that. So when God calls us to do something that is dangerous from a worldly standpoint, we have to recognize the successes or failures of this world are not our mission. That's not the goal that we're going towards. Now, again, Jesus doesn't call us to take risks to be dumb. That's not the point. He's not calling us to live miserable lives. But our worldly successes and failures is not the goal. And so he tells his disciples that he is going to wake Lazarus, and which is a bit confusing. And we can think of that. Even in our language today, sleep can have a dual meaning. But in the New Testament, this word for sleep is used 16 times. 13 of the times it's used to mean death, and 3 times it's used to mean actual sleeping. And so we can see how the disciples might have been a bit confused with this, because they probably remember that Jesus had already said that Lazarus' sickness would not end in death. And so Jesus said, he's just sleeping, so now I'm going to wake him. And they're probably like, if he's sleeping, let him sleep. Right? If someone's ill and they're sleeping, almost every instance you let them sleep, because that helps our body heal. That gives our body strength and the rest it needs to combat whatever illness that it is trying to combat. So why would you go wake him? Why would you go disturb him from something that can be beneficial to him? But the text makes it clear, and Jesus makes it clear, that Lazarus is dead, even though the disciples did not understand it. But again, it comes back to my thought of, why didn't Jesus go faster? And we can say that all the time. Jesus, why didn't you do something sooner? Why don't you do something quicker? Why is this taking so long? And on some level, we can look at the miracles that Jesus performs. Many of the miracles is that Jesus is in some type of situation and somebody comes up to him and says, Jesus, I need you. Someone says, hey, can you do this for me? Can you provide this healing? Can you give me this miracle right here, right now? And many of the times Jesus does. There's a bit of an interaction, but most of the times Jesus provides the miracle in that moment. But I do think we can learn a lesson here with the Lazarus 11 story, is that Jesus is not forced or coerced. Things are done on his timetable, which can be very frustrating for us. But I also hope it's very affirming for us. Because if we served a God who we could control and manipulate, that would not be a God we're serving. If we go to Jesus and says, Jesus, I demand you do something here and now. I deserve it. You have to do it. And if Jesus is forced to do it, that's not a deity we're serving. So Jesus works on his own timetable. He's not forced or coerced. But he makes a statement here. He talks about daylight, that a day has 12 hours in it. And he says a day is not finished before it ends. What Jesus is getting at is that the calling that God has given you, he has given you everything you need to fulfill that calling. And if we can use the time illustration here, that you have enough time to do what God has called you to do. And sometimes we need to hear that. Because we can look at our lists of all the things we think we need to do. And maybe everything on that list is really good, and we say, I don't have time for all of this. But I promise you, you have time for what God has called you to do. Not necessarily the list that we've created ourselves, but we can accomplish what God has called us to do. And so we hold two things in tension. First off, we need to work diligently. God doesn't call us to be couch potatoes. He calls us to work hard for him, but also to not stress out about it, because God has given us what we need to fulfill this. If God has called us to do he's going to give us the ability, the time, the resources, the knowledge to accomplish it. And so to me, it gives me challenge and relief. But the disciple Thomas enters the scene, and if there's one thing you know about Thomas, it probably doesn't come from John chapter 11. It probably comes from John chapter 20. It's when Jesus had appeared to his disciples behind locked doors, and Thomas wasn't there. And then later, the disciples are telling Thomas about it, and he says, I won't believe it until I see the nail holes. And so we have this wonderful term that we give Thomas now. We refer to him as Doubting Thomas. I'm sure in heaven he's going to be real excited for, that's Doubting Thomas, right? Right? That's the one thing we know about him, if we know anything about him. But we see here in John chapter 11, he has courage. He has faith. He has determination that if Jesus is going into a dangerous situation, he's saying, I'm going to follow Jesus. I am not going to back down. I am willing to die with Jesus. And so he is following Jesus with reckless abandonment. So I wanted to point that out to make sure that we recognize that Thomas is not just one-dimensional. There's other components to who he is. But sometimes we get so one-dimensional that we can only think of our particular needs. And a lot of times that happens when we think of chronic issues. When we have pain that just won't go away. And a lot of times that happens in our backs, maybe our heads or our necks. Maybe we get foot pain that just won't go away. And one of the hard things with these types of needs is you're constantly reminded of it. Now, there may be situations where you get relief, but in general, you're just reminded of it. And so we pray, Jesus, take away this pain. And as tough as it is today, I tell you, the momentary miracle is not the mission. So even when we're experiencing pain and discomfort or issues that just won't go away, those are important. And Jesus is not trying to demean them, but there's something greater that he's calling us to. And so Jesus finally gets to Bethany in verse 17. And then when he got there, he was told that Lazarus has been in the grave 4 days. Now, Bethany was only a few miles from Jerusalem, so many had come to console Mary and Martha. When Mary heard Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but when Martha heard Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed in the house. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you'd only been here, my brother would not have died." And Jesus told her, "Your brother will rise again." She said, "Yes, I know he will rise when everyone else rises at the last day." And he told her, "I'm the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me will live even though they die. Everyone who lives and believes in me will never die." He said, "Martha, do you believe this?" She said, "Yes, I've always believed you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one who has come into the world from God." Then she returned to Mary and told her, "The teacher is here and he wants to meet you." So Mary immediately went to Jesus. Now Jesus had stayed outside the village. And then when the people who were consoling Mary saw her get up so hastily, they thought she was going to Lazarus' grave to weep, so they followed her there. When Mary saw Jesus, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if only you'd been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping and the other people wailing with her, he was deeply moved and troubled. As normal as we would expect today, there were many that had gathered to support the family, and this was a common Jewish activity during this time. But we see the interactions with Mary and Jesus and Martha and Jesus had very similar themes to it. The fact of Martha gets there and affirms, "Jesus, if you would have been here, my brother would not be dead." Now, have you ever gone to Jesus and said something like that? "Jesus, if you would have shown up in this way, we would have had this result." Now, maybe we're not as explicit about that, but we do get the impression that Martha, on some level, affirmed that Jesus had power, but also has a deep sense of grief and sorrow that maybe there was a missed opportunity there. Now, when Jesus arrived, it said that Lazarus had been in the grave for 4 days. So there's this Jewish belief at this time that the soul or the spirit of the individual continued to hover around the body for 3 days. And then after 3 days, the spirit went somewhere else, went to Sheol or the place of the dead or something of that nature. And they're not really clear thoughts as to why that was the case, why the 3 days. One of them is that after 4 days, the body starts to change colors in the decomposing process. So maybe that was one of the situations. But we see that 4 days is a significant mention in this text. But Bethany is just a few miles from Jerusalem. It would have been easy for Jesus to get there. It was not like he had to take this real long trek. He could have gotten there easily, but yet he didn't. He stayed where he was for a few days before he went to see Lazarus and his family. Now, one of the things we have to kind of keep in the back of our mind is that we are currently living on this side of Jesus. That we know the story of the crucifixion. We know that Jesus died and he rose again from the grave. We know the resurrection part of the story. But Martha is on the pre-resurrection side of Jesus. And so as Jesus is having this interaction with her, she is answering before Jesus has risen from the grave. And I just think that's really interesting to keep in mind, because what Jesus was asking Martha was, do you believe in the power of God? Do you believe that Jesus has the power that he is preparing to fully reveal? Say, as followers of Jesus, today we believe and embrace the fact that Jesus has resurrection power not just over death, but over life as well. Right? It's not as though he can just stop death. He can give life. Right? So it's not as though he could come and just heal Lazarus. He could restore him so that death has no power over him. But this question that he asked Martha, do you believe this? This is a question we all have to answer. It's a question that Jesus asks everyone. One of the concepts of salvation is it's about believing in Jesus. We confess our sins to him and we believe in him. Now, belief is not just some intellectual acknowledgement. It moves us to serve Jesus. It moves us and changes us to act. But this question, Jesus, is, do you believe this? And it shows the gospel message is confrontational. Not in a way that it tries to make you uncomfortable or put you in a corner, but it says you either believe this or you don't. There's no other choice. And until you actually believe this, you don't believe it. So we have to come to Jesus, and so he is laying this out. Do you believe this? And he uses this phrase I am. And he uses it several times throughout the Gospel of John. And we talk this way. We can use like I am tired or I am hungry. It's not as though Jesus was talking awkwardly within the language, but the I am statement is not just one we should pass over because it connects all the way back to Exodus chapter 3. We find Moses has been just called by God to go to Egypt and lead the Israelites out of slavery from the hands of the Egyptians. And Moses asked a really good question. Now remember, Exodus chapter 3, it's the second book of the Bible. We have all of Genesis, 2 chapters of Exodus, and now we're in Exodus chapter 3. So from a narrative standpoint, we don't have a lot of information yet. So we get to Exodus chapter 3. God calls Moses, and Moses says, who should I tell the people sent me? And God responds in Exodus chapter 3, verse 14, I am who I am. Say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. That's kind of an awkward way to structure a sentence. And partially because how God is referring to himself. But when God is referring to himself as the I am, he is affirming the fact that he is eternal. He's affirming the fact that he always has existed. He always has existed. He always will exist. God is eternal, and by being eternal, it shows that God is the Lord over the universe. He is the Almighty, the Creator, that before him nothing existed, and only through him have things come into existence. So God is affirming his power over the created world. And in John chapter 11, and in other places in John, we affirm that Jesus is tying himself to these I am statements, affirming his divinity, affirming that he is the Almighty in flesh revealed to us. And so there is some power in that statement that I just don't want us to miss. So he tells this to Martha. And then he has a similar interaction with Mary. It's a little less of an interaction in this moment, but he has a similar interaction where she says, if you were here, my brother would not have died. See, Mary and Martha, in this moment, were both consumed by life's impossibilities. They were both consumed by the trials, by the obstacles, by the things that they felt were lacking. How many times do we do that? How many times do we go through life and say, this is what we're missing? Why is God not stepping up in this way? Why is this miracle not coming? Why is God not answering my requests? But momentary miracles are not the mission. There's something deeper, something more. But another temporary prayer request that we often have is that of difficult diseases that are at least somewhat treatable, or at least they say they're treatable. Probably the most obvious one we can think of is cancer. I know there's some of you that are going through cancer and have loved ones that are going through cancer. I'm not trying to minimize that, but to recognize our bodies are mortal, and the fact of our calling for Jesus is not to live forever right here, right now, in this way. Now, I'm not trying to be morbid about that. We're going to a point, so stay with me for a little bit here. But I hope we recognize that we have such a focus on the temporary sometimes that we forget that there's something greater. Because Jesus continues with the Lazarus story in verse 34, and he says, "Where have you put Lazarus?" And said, "Lord, come this way." Then Jesus wept. And those who saw him, some said, "Look how much he loved Lazarus." And others said, "Didn't he heal the blind man? Couldn't he have kept Lazarus from dying?" Now, when Jesus arrived at the tomb, he was still moved. He told Martha, "Roll the stone aside." But she protested, "Lord, it's been 4 days. The smell will be terrible." And Jesus responded, "Didn't I tell you that if you believe, you would see the glory of God?" So they rolled away the stone. Then Jesus stepped forward and looked up to heaven and said, "Lord, Father, thank you for hearing me. You always hear me, but I say it out loud for the sake of these people, so they might believe you sent me." Then he shouted in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" And the dead man came out, wrapped and bound in grave clothes. And Jesus told them, "Unwrap him and let him go." So Jesus was taken to the tomb, and we see that in many ways his humanity was displayed. When it says that he wept, that he was hurting, he grieved, he mourned, which lets us know that these temporary issues that we struggle with have meaning. They have value. And it hurt Jesus because he saw the brokenness of the world and the hurt that it was causing people. But through Jesus, we're not moving towards the past. We're not just trying to make the present better. We're moving towards the future. Not minimizing the past or forgetting the present, but we're moving towards the future with Jesus. And so as people saw Jesus weeping, some said, "Oh, he loved Lazarus." Others questioned, "Why didn't he do anything?" Which again is what we do. "Jesus, why didn't you show up? Why didn't you answer the request that I wanted? Why didn't you do it in the way that I wanted you to do it? Did you not care? Do you not care about me?" So we always ask, why doesn't Jesus show up when I want him to? Why doesn't Jesus answer my requests? And on some level, I think we have to make sure we recognize that the momentary miracle is not the mission. There's something greater, something deeper that Jesus is calling us to. But in this moment, he orders the stone moved, which is a real strange request, as Martha points out, that there would be a bad odor, bad smell at that time. Because and that time period, they didn't really have much embalming, particularly with the average or even the upper class individuals. A typical setup for a tomb like this would have been something carved into the rock that had 3 shelves on either side and 2 shelves in the back, so 8 shelves total. And the most recently deceased individuals would be placed on the shelves, and then after their bodies had decayed, they would be honorably put in a different part of the tomb to make room for others who would need that space when they became deceased. And so it was a bit of an awkward situation, but as we think about Jesus, he wept, he was grieving, he was mourning, he was hurting. So it may have been he just wanted to see Lazarus one last time. That might have been something that were going through the minds of the people there, which is a normal thing. When we think about funerals and gravesides of it's difficult when the casket is closed. It's difficult when the casket is lowered into the ground, and we recognize those moments are difficult. And honestly, a lot of times when we go visit the graves of loved ones, we do that for our own grieving and mourning process. But that's not where the story ends, and we know the stone was rolled away, and Jesus said in a loud voice, and I was wondering, why did he say it in a loud voice? What was happening here? And while I don't think this is true, I almost get an image of Lazarus is alive at this moment. And he's like in on it. He knows what's happening. In on it, not as though they're deceiving people. That's not my point. But like he knows what's about to happen. And so he's like in the tomb, like he's ready to go. He's like, this is going to be fun. This is going to be really exciting. And but he's like, but I got to wait for Jesus. I got to wait for the cue. I've got to wait for Jesus to let me know when to come out, because we got to build a proper suspense to make sure we get the biggest reaction, right? And so Jesus calls out in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. And he comes out. Can you imagine what that would be? I just see some strutting going on, right? Or maybe let's get some high fives going. Like what would have been going through his mind, right? That can be a fun conversation to talk with Lazarus about. But as I think about the power of Jesus, one of the things I recognize is that the same God of the Old Testament is the same God of the New Testament, and is the same God that we serve today. And you know what? That power hasn't dissipated. That power hasn't vanished. That power hasn't somehow become less. But I think what happens sometimes is, unless we hear a story like Lazarus, we kind of forget that God's on the move. You know, I said last week, I can begin to hear the rattling. And that's a reference to Ezekiel chapter 37, where God restores the dry bones and makes them flesh and living again. And when they came together, they rattled, they moved. There was some noise that was happening. Because when God moves, we can start to see signs of it. When God does something, there's evidence of it. And so I want to testify to a couple things that have happened recently in our local church. Because on February 12th, 2023, I'm not going to say the person's name because I don't know. I didn't get permission. I don't know if they want this attention. But there's an individual, and if you're here, you may remember, who was anointed for healing for Charlie Corns. And some of you might not know Charlie because his health has been very poor recently. And so that was on February 12th, 2023. I think it was over there. I think so. I'm going to confirm that. But the person was anointed for healing for Charlie. Since that day, Charlie's been a different person. He started eating. His wife, Nancy, says she can't keep enough food in the house anymore. The other day I called him, he said, I slept in my own bed the other night. Right? And so we see that God is moving in his life. Now I recognize that's a physical need. That is a temporary issue. But we praise God that he's moving. Right? Lazarus was a temporary need, temporary issue, right? We can praise God for that. But the other one is on February 26, 2023. We're singing the song, Jesus Loves Me. And not the children's church song, but that's a good song too. But there's a person who came to the altar, and I don't want to put words in this person's mouth, but essentially, God had done a work in their marriage, had done some healing and restoration. That was, and the person came to the altar right there. I remember it right there. And now that person testifies that there's still work to do, right? But God had brought healing, had brought a miracle in that relationship, and the person stood up on stage and talked about it. And so what I'm getting at is God answers our prayer requests. God is active. He is moving. He is alive. He's doing work in and through us. He is not dead. He is still doing. This is the I am that we are talking about. He has power over death and life. But I want to come back to this temporary prayers that we tend to cling to. Because the last one that I'll mention is those terminal illnesses that really take a toll on, all terminal illnesses take a toll on us. But things like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, that you just see the slow degrading of the individual, and there's little to nothing that you can do about it. Little to nothing, even just to slow it down. And we say, Jesus, heal. We know He can. But so many times, He doesn't. And it's hard. Because we want the Lazarus story. That's what we want. And there's nothing wrong with wanting that. There's nothing wrong with praying huge, impossible prayers to God. In fact, it could be argued that it's disrespectful not to pray huge, impossible prayers to God. But the thing about Lazarus is, you know what? He died again. The biggest purpose of Jesus was not just to come raise him from the grave on that day, and that was it. That was an extra special miracle that God provided for Lazarus. But so many times we get caught up on these temporary needs that we forget that Jesus has greater things in store for us. And I'm not trying to degrade our prayers. I'm not trying to degrade our mortality or say there's anything wrong with that or even diminish our current struggles. But we have to answer the question that Jesus asked Martha. Do you believe this? Because if you believe your only hope is in these momentary miracles, life eventually is going to be disappointing. Life is eventually going to be devastating. Because eventually death is going to come. But if we believe this, if we believe that Jesus is the resurrection and the life, then anything we encounter, we can say, this may not be ideal from a worldly standpoint, but this does not have to consume us. Because there's greater things. Jesus came not just to fix our temporary problems. He came to fix the eternal problem. So that we could have eternal life. Not just a little bit better life now. He came so that we could have eternal life. So I don't know where you are today. Maybe you're in a really good place, an encouraging place. You say, God is good. He's doing awesome things. Maybe you're saying, I don't know why God isn't showing up. I'm not sure why He's not listening or responding in the ways that I think I need. But wherever you are today, I want to encourage you to rise up. I would encourage you to say, you know what? I don't have to be consumed by these temporary things. These temporary things are frustrating. They're debilitating. Maybe they make it so I can't do anything. But if I believe the question that Jesus asked Martha, then I know that these temporary problems are not my end.